Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the research on pornography. I should tell you, by the way, the bulk of the small amount of research that we have to supposedly support this idea that the brain is involved in sex addiction the same way that it's involved in alcohol and drug addiction has focused almost exclusively on compulsive pornography and compulsive use of pornography. So that's a bit of a limitation there because it's really a narrow focus, right? And that's been one of the criticisms of this research. Nonetheless, let me tell you a little bit more about what the research shows on pornographic compulsive activity. The Max Planck Institute, which is a very well-known, reputable research institute in Germany. In 2014, same year as the other study by Voon and colleagues, first brain scan study on compulsive pornography users. And so remember, brain scans enable us to see the brain in action. And just another reminder, although you guys should be really well versed in this by now, fMRI, functional MRI, we can measure blood flow differences across different areas of the brain to get insight into which areas of the brain are more or less functional at a given point in time. PET scans use a radioactive dye that provides the same kind of information, which parts of the brain are more versus less metabolically active, and that gives us insight again into which parts of the brain are more or less active at a given point in time. These brain scan studies in 2014 at the Max Planck Institute were the first done on compulsive users of pornography. The researchers found several brain changes that they correlated with the amount of pornography the person consumed. So correlation, remember, tells us the relationship between two variables of interest to us. Doesn't tell us about causality, but it tells us if there's a systematic relationship between variables of interest. Does one increase as the other increases? Does one increase as the other decreases, or is there no relationship between these variables at all? Here's what the researchers found. 3 findings they argued support the idea that there is brain involvement in sex addiction parallel to brain involvement in alcohol and drug addiction. 1, the more hours per week that individuals in the study reported viewing in terms of pornographic material, that was correlated with a reduction in gray matter in sections of the reward circuitry of the brain, particularly the reward circuitry aspects of the brain involved in motivation and decision making. In other words, as people reported consuming more pornography per week, the areas of their brain that are involved in decision making and motivation we're losing gray matter, negative correlation. One goes up, the other goes down. The researchers report that this is meaningful because they say this is an indication that long-term excessive porn use or porn exposure results in a reduction in gray matter in reward-related regions of the brain, which means, essentially, reduced gray matter means fewer nerve connections. In other words, reward activity in the brain is becoming sluggish. It's numbing the pleasure pathway of the brain. It's desensitizing the pleasure pathway of the brain, which is, as you guys know, similar to what happens with chronic drug use. Your reward circuit eventually gets suppressed if you stop using. You cannot make dopamine on your own if you stop using, right? So you need more and more and more and more of that drug or alcohol to stimulate a pathway that previously could be stimulated by normal pleasures. The researchers here argue the loss of gray matter indicates a desensitizing of those regions of the brain involved in reward and pleasure. And that's why the individual has to keep seeking out more and more and more pornography over time. Second, number 2, nerve connections between the reward circuitry of the brain. Again, it's that same limbic system area through which dopamine flows. Nerve connections between the reward circuit of the brain and the prefrontal cortex. Remember, that's the part of the brain, that's the stop system. The one that says, wait a minute, let's think this through. Let's not act impulsively. That's your stop system. The connections between the go system and the stop system, the reward circuitry and the prefrontal cortex, have been decreased with greater porn watching. Okay, so again, negative correlation. More pornographic watching, more pornographic consumption, fewer connections between the stop system and the go system. And dysfunction in this circuitry has been related to inappropriate behavioral choices and impulsive, risky behaviors like drug seeking. Because the part of your brain that is reflective and has judgment and rational thinking is being shut off from the part of your brain that's saying, this is important, this is pleasurable, do it, do it, do it, do it. Just like we talked about with drug and alcohol use, the researchers argue this evidence shows the same thing happens with overconsumption of pornographic sexual material. The researchers said the same would happen with seeking out pornography then. There's evidence of an association between high levels of pornography use and impaired impulse control. And they argue this is an indicator of something called hypofrontality. Hypofrontality describes a brain state in which there is a decrease in cerebral blood flow in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So this means the area of your brain that's responsible for making judgments, for rational thinking, for inhibiting impulse or rash decision making, is receiving less blood flow, and therefore it is not functioning as adequately anymore over time when a person engages in excessive sexual, in this case pornographic use, similar to what happens with people addicted to drugs and alcohol. Okay, so that's 1, 2. This is number 3. The third finding from the Max Planck Institute with regard to excessive pornographic users is the more pornography the people, let's try that again. The more pornography the participants reported consuming in a given week, the less reward activation in their brain when sexual images were flashed on the screen. What the researchers interpret this to mean is much like excessive drug use over time. You need more and more and more and more of your addiction target to get the same response, right? So in this case, again, more evidence for building up tolerance and having desensitization, just like in drug and alcohol addiction, where eventually people need an excessive amount of the drug or alcohol to get any pathway stimulation where dopamine flows. Similarly, they argue here for the people at the highest levels of pornography use, when they were shown images related to sexuality, the reward circuit of their brain was not stimulated as much, was not active as much. They needed far more images to get the same level of activation in the brain as people who consume fewer amounts of porn per week or no porn per week. And they're arguing this is analogical to drug and alcohol addiction because at some point with excessive use of drugs and alcohol, the dopaminergic pathways in the brain become desensitized. They don't respond as easily as they did before to drugs and alcohol. They build up a tolerance, and they need higher and higher and higher amounts of the drug or alcohol to get any stimulation in those pathways. And so based on these 3 findings at the Max Planck Institute, the researchers argued, look, we have a very clear analogy here to the same findings with brain scan data in people who are addicted to drugs and alcohol, so there is no reason to argue that excessive sexual involvement doesn't hijack the brain in the same way, doesn't change the brain in the same way as excessive drug and alcohol use. So meet me on the next slide. I'm going to talk about one more set of findings before we draw a conclusion about sex addiction. Is it real? Is it not? What do we take away from this data? Meet you on our next slide.